Hello, I'm Susan Weinstein, Co-Executive Director at Families for Depression Awareness. Welcome to our Coping with Stress and Depression webinar. We appreciate you spending your valuable time with us to learn about how you might be able to better manage your stress and to know when and how to seek professional help. We expect that this webinar will last an hour, including questions and answers. You'll see that you can download a handout of the slides by clicking on the event message or on the link in the materials section. Please submit your questions throughout the program. As I reviewed your registration forms to see what you want to learn from this webinar, I saw that a great deal of you expressed interest in work-related stress and news-related stress. So I'm happy to report that we will be covering both of those things. They're on our radar for sure. I will note that some people expressed interest in some topics that we're not going to be covering. If you are only interested in teen depression or adult bipolar disorder or depression treatment, then please go check out those webinars that are on our website. After the webinar, we're going to count on you to give us your feedback on our online survey. You'll help us improve our program, and we will send you a free copy of our Coping with Stress brochure as a thank you. When the webinar concludes, you should arrive at the survey page, but the link is also available on the Educational Webinars page of our website, which is at familyaware.org. For those of you who are watching in a group, we'd love to hear from each of you. So you should each fill out a survey, and we'll gladly send you the brochure. Of course, if you find that this webinar is helpful to you, please forward the link to your friends and colleagues. The recorded webinar will be available for viewing for a limited time on our website, familyaware.org. Finally, we hope that you will help us reach more people by making a tax-deductible contribution to Families for Depression Awareness. This is our agenda for the program. Whoops, there we go. And you'll see that we're going to be talking about how to identify signs of stress, how the news affects our stress, what we can do to manage the impact of news and social media on our well-being. We'll talk about ways to manage stress. We'll explore when it's more than stress. We'll be looking at anxiety and depression, what are their signs and symptoms, what you can do to get help. I'll jump back in and talk some about Families for Depression Awareness, and we'll have questions and answers. Then we'll wrap up and send you off to complete the survey. At this point, I am very pleased to introduce our expert, Dr. Mary McNaughton-Castle. Dr. McNaughton-Castle received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of California at San Diego and the San Diego State University Joint Clinical Doctoral Program. As a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at San Antonio, she has received a number of honors over the course of her 20 years there. Dr. McNaughton-Castle has been awarded the Chancellor's Council Teaching Award, the UTSA Student Government Distinguished Faculty Award, the Honors College Outstanding Mentorship Award, the Howe Service to Students Award, and the UT Regents Outstanding Teaching Award. She is also a fellow of the UT System Distinguished Teaching Academy. The reason why we wanted to bring Dr. McNaughton-Castle in is because she does research on stress management. She's also published a variety of articles in academic journals, and she's the author of a couple of different books. One is Mind the Gap, Coping with Stress in the Modern World, which I think is extremely timely, as well as Adapt and Overcome, Essays on the Student-Veteran Experience. She chairs a university committee to increase faculty awareness of student mental health issues, and she's the advisor to the Student Psychology Club and the campus chapter of Active Minds. So it's a pleasure for us to have someone who is not only invested in teaching, but also invested in the people that she works with and the students who she encounters. Dr. McNaughton-Castle, thank you so much for being here. As you requested, I'll be chiming in with questions as we progress through the webinar, and we'll circle back with other questions at the end. Why don't we get started? I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I am always happy to talk about stress and depression and anxiety and coping. As you can tell, I'm in the lucky position of being able to focus my professional career on this topic from a number of angles. So, as you said, I do research and teach about stress, but I also have a small clinical practice, so I work with people who are coping with stress and depression on a regular basis. As we go through, I hope you do put in questions as they come up, and what I'm going to try to do is talk about stress and coping from both a research angle, what we know from the literature, but also a practical angle in terms of how people can apply these things in their own lives. So, of course, the first question that I always get if we go to the slide on the definition of stress is, what is stress? How do we define it? How do we know we're stressed? The early researchers actually thought about stress in terms of pressure on the physical system, stress on your body's ability to cope, so perhaps illness or injury or adverse circumstances. Of course, we now have extended that definition to talking about stress as psychological pressure as well. So if you are sick or caring for someone who is ill, you may both be experiencing stress because of the illness and the psychological pressures around it. Now, the term stress is a little confusing, and in fact, the original researcher who coined it, Hans Selye, has since said he wished he had called it strain instead of stress, because English wasn't his first language, and he said he wasn't as adept as he wished he'd been. But what he tried to do to separate the problem is to talk about stressors as things that cause stress, and then stress responses as how you respond to the stress. And that's different because in normal conversation, we'll use stress a lot of ways. We'll say, I was stressed, you're making me stressed, this is stressful. So we'll try to keep those clear. Now, the next slide indicates something that's really important when you're thinking about stress, and that's whether the situation, the stressor, is acute, meaning that there is an end in sight. You'll be done with the test. You will get your check on Friday and have the money to pay your bills. And that sort of stress, and acute stress, has a different impact on the mind and body than chronic stresses or ones that are not necessarily clearly time-defined. But within that definition, one of the things people will say is, all right, the stressor is acute or chronic, but how I feel is very similar. So I'd like people for just a minute to think about how you feel when you're under an acutely stressful situation. In my classes, I ask students to imagine that you're standing on the corner, waiting to cross the street, and a car swerves and looks for a minute like it's going to jump up on the curb. So you think about how your mouth gets dry, your muscles tense, you start breathing very rapidly, your attention focuses very narrowly, and hopefully the car misses you, and your body pretty quickly goes back to its normal state. The problem is when you have that stress response frequently, or it lasts for long periods of time, and it can start to disrupt all sorts of physiological responses. The slide on signs of stress indicates some of the ways that stress can cause health problems. If you look at it, you might actually notice that there are a few things that seem to be sort of your go-to problems. Some people under stress get muscle tension, headaches, tight shoulders, tight jaws. Other people feel their stress more in their stomach, their digestion, irritable bowel kinds of problems. Some people report cognitive stress issues. They are either unable to let go of thoughts, or they find themselves having trouble concentrating on things that they need to do. And other folks find that what happens when they're very stressed is that they make choices like smoking or drinking or doing something else, that might distract them in the short run, but then circle back and cause problems longer. So as you look at the signs of stress, what you might want to identify is your pattern, because there are probably some genetic or biological reasons that you respond in that way. And understanding your own signs of stress can be a gateway into figuring out how to manage them when we get to that point. If you go to the slide on fight or flight responses, we can talk for a minute about why your body would respond to stress in this way. And it comes down to our evolutionary history. Throughout most of human history, there were a lot of life-threatening stressors that people were dealing with. Were you going to find food? Did you have shelter from the elements? Were there predators stalking you? And those kind of elemental stressors or strains tend to require a major physiological burst of energy. If a tiger's chasing you, you want to run or be able to climb up a tree. If you have a chance to hide, you might have to seek that place quickly. So what happens in a fight or flight response is your body redistributes resources to mobilize energy. So your heart rate goes up and your blood pressure go up. And those are very important because that's allowing you to have more oxygen and glucose in the large muscles like your legs that would need to run. You will also find that your eyes dilate because you are focusing on the stressor. Things like digestion, which your body is going to count as being non-essential if you're running away from a tiger, will shut down. And all of those responses can be very helpful in an acutely stressful situation where there's an actual physical response you can make. But in the modern world, most of the time, those aren't the kind of stressors we have. We're frustrated at our boss, we're overwhelmed by deadlines, we're mad at people who cut us off on the freeway, we're dealing with technology, and you might want to run away or hit your boss or do something like that. But of course, socially, that's not an option. So you have this huge physiological arousal and response without any real ways to dissipate that energy. And in the meantime, your body put out a lot of energy in order to facilitate that response, so it can lead to fatigue and other problems as you go on. Now, it's really a bigger topic than we could really cover here. In my stress management class, I actually talk about how stress impacts diseases, affects your immune system, relates to heart disease, and that takes about 3 hours worth of lectures. But if you look at the slide where it says chronic stress takes a toll, you can see that there are a lot of things that can happen. If you are having multiple frequent fight or flight responses, and you already perhaps have some signs or symptoms of heart disease. Maybe you have high cholesterol or high blood pressure. You've got buildup of plaque in your arteries. Then those increases in blood pressure and heart rate, which come with fight or flight, could put pressure on the system and could predispose you to having further heart kinds of issues. Chronic stress can also affect your immune system's ability to fight off things like viruses, colds, other invaders. And of course, it can have an effect on everything from reproductive issues like infertility to things like sleep problems. So we know that stress has an impact on health. The good news is that there are ways to manage, reduce those factors, and we'll be talking about them. But you might really want to take a look at the link on the slide that gives you the chance to take a stress test. This is based on a stress test that a couple of researchers named Holmes and Ray developed way back in the late 60s and 70s. They were actually working with the U.S. Navy, looking at stress, and decided to see whether stressful life events, things like being divorced, losing a spouse, losing a job, having financial problems, had a negative impact on people's health. To do that, they surveyed sailors about the stress they had experienced, and then they followed their health while they were deployed in the Navy in the Western Pacific. And what they found was that people who went into those deployments with high levels of personal stress were more likely to get sick and have symptoms that were extreme when they did get sick during the 6 months or whatever the time of the cruise was. And, usually human studies are hard to narrow down because we're different, we have different diets, different environment. But when you're looking at a group of people on the same boat, you can control some of those things. Since that time, there have been hundreds of studies in stress and illness, and there's variability depending on what the illness is. But what we know is that the modern world is taking a toll on people, and it can contribute to both physical and psychological problems. Now, my own personal interest in terms of studying stress has really been on how we cope with the stressful events that are relatively new to humans. If you think about the long history of human development and then the rapid changes in the last 50 years when we developed everything from radio and TV to technology, the internet, satellite feeds, cell phones, it's almost almost impossible to talk about how much and how fast those changes have affected our lives. One of the assignments I have my students do, which turned out to be pretty interesting and is something you could do on your own, is try to figure out a little bit about your family history. If you can get information on your grandparents or your great-grandparents, where they lived, who they lived with, how many kids they had, how many of those children survived to adulthood, who had psychological problems or issues with things like alcohol, what kinds of stressors did they experience. I give my students a week to do this, and some of them actually have to call their families, which is interesting because it opens up whole new areas of discussion. But they always come back with a new awareness of how much physically harder life was for folks 50, 60 years ago. But that does not mean that the stressors they're dealing with are trivial. They are a different type of stress. Most of us are not acutely worried about whether we have enough food for our kids or threats to life, although, of course, a hurricane or a disaster can change that. But on the whole, we are dealing with daily hassles, lots of individual frustrations, peppered with situations like companies merging, difficulties with bureaucracy, technology, finances, other things. So we're dealing with a different set of stressors. And what I often tell students is that if you go back in psychology and look at things like the hierarchy that a fellow named Abraham Maslow put together, there are different layers of stress. If you don't have enough food or if you don't have a secure place to stay, that's going to be the most important thing you focus on. But once those are taken care of, we don't just sit back and say, well, I'm good. I'll just sit here now in my lawn chair and eat. We say, well, now I want to belong and I want to accumulate things and I want to achieve and I want to take care of my kids and give them opportunities. So there's a certain striving in humans that means that we continue to try to improve our situation even after we meet our basic needs, but doing that can lead to stress. Now, part of it is technology and part of it is information. And again, it's very hard to emphasize, especially for me, to tell college students how quickly that's changed. You know, they look at you like you're a dinosaur. If I say, well, you know, I remember my grandmother still had the party line telephone. Or when I grew up, we didn't have 24-hour news coverage. The news went off at midnight. They played the national anthem, and it didn't come back on again until morning. But since CNN started the first 24-hour television coverage, we have moved into a whole different era. And again, it's worth it to think about this in terms of history a little bit. If you back up and look at the Revolution or the Civil War, there are instances where people carried out activities. There were even battles that happened after truces or the end of wars had been declared because the message didn't get to people very quickly. And when you did get it, it was either an oral message or perhaps a newspaper account with drawings. And those tend to be less sensational than the kind of information we get today, where you have a breathless reporter standing in the middle of a square somewhere with live camera and satellite feed saying a bomb's going overhead now and we're going to see where it hits. So in the old days, you had to struggle to get information. It was often delayed, and it wasn't terribly viscerally gripping. I mean, it might be good or bad information. You might be very disturbed by what it said, but you weren't necessarily watching babies who were victims of violence wash up on a beach, or people get shot, or other things. So we have come to think that this kind of flow of news is normal, but really it's not very normal. There has never been an experiment like this where people were exposed to so much. And it's become very hard for people to figure out how to manage it. Part of the problem today is not, do I have enough information? It's like there's so much information I don't know what to pay attention to. Yeah, and I don't know what to trust.
Right, and I think we need to accept that this is the new normal, so how do we manage all that?
Exactly. And we have to remember as well that there has always been a problem with fake news. Sometimes students say, well, it's all fake, I don't know what to look at, and I always tell them, just go look up the Spanish-American War on Wikipedia, which was started by fake news. But with that flood of information and the negative sensational nature, we have to be much more aware ourselves of how we manage it. And I do have some guidelines for that. Back when I said, think about what makes you stressed, I asked people to pay attention. So think about when you hear or watch the media, what topics bother you, and what kinds of delivery bother you. So personally, for me, watching stressful television, seeing live pictures bothers me because by the time I realize I didn't want to see it, it's too late. So if you move to the slide that shows what you can do, I argue that people need to tailor their news feed. If you don't want to see pictures, then get your news from the radio or the internet where you can control it. Now people will say, well, social media is a problem. I get so much news feedback through my friends. And again, I really argue that we can take control of that. You don't have to check your email or your social media constantly. You can certainly set one time a day to check it. And you don't have to take messages from people. If you've got an uncle or a friend who sends you Facebook or email messages that you disagree with or that find you upsetting, don't read them. Delete them. You don't have to do that. There isn't a social obligation, but somehow media and text and Facebook sometimes make us feel like we have to. The other thing you have to really do is start to think critically about the media itself, sources of media, who's telling the story, what do they have to gain by convincing you to believe their version over someone else's? Does that source of media actually have credibility, or are they trying to sell something? And I wish really that we taught all of this starting in probably middle school, media literacy. There's some great resources online if you haven't thought about it. And I also think that maybe we can, as individuals, push the media to be a little more responsible about this. If anyone is interested, there's a website called Solutions Journalism. And they have pulled together a large group of reporters who are trying to get news organizations to go beyond reporting problems and scandal and spend more time talking about solutions and what works and what doesn't and how people are solving problems. And I think that's the piece that's missing right now. And I've listed the point about act locally, because if you just watch a never-ending series of negative, depressing kinds of stories in the media, it's really easy to feel helpless and to assume there's nothing you can do. And again, prior to this media onslaught, people knew about bad things. If there was a flood or a war where you live, you would face it, but then you could act locally. You could do something to help people. And so if you're watching the news and you find yourself upset about the plight of people or animals or the climate, maybe somewhere far away from you, I say, well, then turn that into doing something you can. You know, if you're worried about animal welfare, then go volunteer at the Humane Society or make a donation to a group that can help you. And it's amazing how much just taking action can make you feel better, even though we know it's not going to change everything, but it gives you a start. And as humans, we tend to like to be moving forward, to be doing something.
So
now, if you
Dr.
go
McNaughton-Castle, Dr. McNaughton-Castle, when you know, this is helpful that you can, you know, refuse someone's message, or you can turn off your news feed, or however it is that you choose that. But there are a lot of situations that people really can't escape from like that. They, you know, maybe they have a chronic illness or a difficult boss or a stressful job. You know, those are the kinds of things that people really also need help with. And I am hoping that we can talk about some things that will help people on a longer term.
Absolutely. Well, there's 2 points to that. You know, and there's one issue is how much of what you see in the media is sort of fanning or contributing to the stress you're feeling in your life. And I think, again, right now, if you're feeling financial difficulties, health difficulties, part of the problem is there is so much turmoil about how we're going to solve those problems as a country that can make it worse. So there's a synergistic effect between what you're dealing with and what the media is doing. But in your own life, you can really turn some of these same thoughts to managing your stresses. Now, when we're talking about stress and coping, we might not use the word think critically, but in a few minutes I'm going to actually talk about that, because I think that is part of how you manage your own stress, by defining and thinking about how you are responding and how you're letting it upset you. You might think about using this as a way to frame it. When I think about stress, I think about it as the gap between what you have and what you want. Now, sometimes you can't fix that. If you have a spouse who has Alzheimer's disease, we don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, so you can't fix that gap. But you could certainly think about what kind of care you want to provide, what kind of support you need from other people, what kind of resources you can look for. And I use the phrase mind the gap, which some of the listeners who've traveled in Europe might recognize. When you're in London and you go to get on the tube, which is their subway, instead of saying watch your step, it says mind the gap, meaning don't put your foot in the hole. But for me, the way that we manage those gaps between what we have and what we want often has to happen in our mind, because we can't necessarily just fix things. So I know you mentioned workplace stress is a problem for people. You know, so often people are in jobs that are either overwhelming or boring, or their work colleagues are not supportive, or they're not getting promoted the way they would like to. And there may not be a short-term solution for that. You may not be able to just quit and walk out. But what I would have people do is consciously, critically think, what are the gaps? What is good about my job and what is not? Where do I want to be a year from now or 3 years from now? And then create a plan for what I will need to do to get the skills, the flexibility, the time to do that. And that's what I would think of as minding the gap. Now, that's a long-term plan. It's not going to help you if you had a horrible day at work and you get home and, you know, the kids and the dog and everything else are going on. So you probably need some strategies for coping in the short run. We have a slide here that talks about strategies, a lot of really useful suggestions there. And I'd like to sort of give people a mnemonic that I use to organize those in your head. There are some strategies that are really sorts of action. Maybe you can do yoga or exercise or get out and walk or get to bed earlier so you can act. Sometimes you really need to distract yourself from the stressful situation, getting out in nature, praying, watching something on TV, reading a book. So I talk a lot about act and distract. And then I add in interact, using friends and contact with other people to get a new perspective or to reframe things. And as you think about that, you have to apply them to the right situation. You know, if you have just discovered an odd lump on your body, you probably don't want to use distraction and say, oh, I'm not going to go to the doctor. You want to act and get it checked out. But if you're in a situation where there aren't some easy fixes, distraction might allow you to rebuild your energy and calm down enough to be able to keep going. Now, there's some other things that research is starting to really support in terms of managing stress. Enjoying little things is huge. And it's hard because our brains, in keeping with fight or flight, are wired to focus on the negative. If I eat red berries and they make me sick, I want to remember that and not eat them. Probably I'll remember getting sick off the red berries better than I will an okay meal off the green berries that didn't make me sick. So we focus on the negative, but we can get pleasure out of the little things, the small beauty around us, things that people do that are kind or caring, and a whole category of things which I think are not coincidentally associated with some of the religious and spiritual tenets of some of our major religions. For example, being grateful or thankful for what you have actually has been shown to improve well-being and be a way of managing stress. So has volunteering, helping other people, nurturing someone else, doing something kind or good for the environment or good for other people. Getting out in nature, it looks like that is a very important way of enjoying the little things, even if all you do is park farther from your office so that you get a little bit of natural sun and walk into the office rather than just, scurrying into the elevator like I do when I'm late. But this comes back to critical thinking, which on the stress management side often gets called reframing. Thinking about how you are conceptualizing the stresses in your life, whether you are blaming yourself, blaming other people, ruminating, focusing on the negative. I'm trying to turn those around. Now, there's a whole field of psychology called cognitive behavioral psychology. There's a book I love, if you get a chance to check out, Rapid Relief from Emotional Distress by Emery and Campbell, which gives you some very nice suggestions for how to practice these reframing. But even if you just want to play it yourself sometime, just for a few days, make a list. Every time you get stressed, write down what happened, then write down where you were and what you were thinking, and then write down what you were feeling, and then think if there's an alternative. So you were late for work, you pulled in the parking lot, someone zipped up the other way and took your parking spot, you were angry, you were frustrated, you were irritable, you got out of the car and slammed the door and dropped your keys and banged your head. And all of those things give you some information. Now, maybe the person who cut you off really was being hostile, but maybe they didn't notice you, or they were late too. And maybe tomorrow, if you just left 5 minutes earlier, you could make it different. So instead of just focusing on the event, you try to think of alternative ways to look at it. And I would say alternative ways that you can do something that can give you a chance to make a change. Now, the other place you can think about reframing and not just being negative lies in how you think about yourself. Many of us are far more negative and critical of ourselves than we are of other people. Sometimes when I'm doing therapy, I'll say to people, would you say that to your child? You just told me that you're hopeless and lazy and not helpful and whiny, and I'm looking at someone who's in great stress, and I don't think I would say that to a kid to make them feel better. Let's think about what you're doing well. Let's give yourself some credit for what you are managing. And I think that's something that people often forget to do, or maybe you've even kind of been taught that thinking about your positive attributes is bragging or not being humble. But I don't think that's the case if you're thinking about your positive attributes realistically. Bragging would be saying that you can do something you can't do, but you know, if you're a single mom raising a couple kids, working in a tough job, juggling a lot, you should give yourself some credit for time management and motivation and focus and being caring, and that would not be considered bragging. Another problem on this self-assessment.
Sorry about that. Someone had said that they had hoped to learn how to love and take care of themselves better. And I think that you just really answered their question there by emphasizing, you know, looking for the positive, giving yourself credit, not being as self-critical. And I think someone once talked to me about putting on reality glasses. You know, take a look and objective at yourself.
All right, I like that. That's a good way. And I would add that if you're being very negative about yourself, you want to assess how much you're letting social media influence that. My sister has called social media year-round Christmas cards, because we all get those Christmas letters sometimes where people tell only the good things. And it's really a problem. We don't want to look bad on social media. So we can have 4 bad things happen, but we're going to post the 1 win of the week. Well, if you're feeling down on yourself and looking at social media, you might assume that everyone else has a whole bunch of good things, when really they are only posting their good thing and you're comparing it to all the bad things you know that happened in your life. So you want to take that with a grain of salt. And the other thing, which is really important in the next slide, is the sense of balance. I had a supervisor when I was training to be a psychologist who really emphasized this idea of self-care, and the analogy he always uses when you went to life-saving training or lifeguard training, the first thing they tell you is do not jump in when someone's drowning and let them grab you around the neck and make you drown too. Plant your feet on the deck and throw them a life ring. Give them help, but keep yourself stable. A lot of people, and often caregivers and often women, feel so obligated to take care of everybody else that they forget that. And if you aren't taking care of yourself, then eventually you're not going to be able to take care of anyone else. So it's not selfish to say, you know what, I need a little more sleep, or I need a weekend off, or I need to ask for more help. Because if you don't do that and you get either psychologically or physically ill, that's going to end up being a problem. Now, the cognitive suggestions I've made have to do with how you think about managing stress. But there are also a lot of techniques now that you can use to access what I consider the opposite of the fight or flight response. So the fight or flight response is part of your sympathetic nervous system. But when you're not in fight or flight, your body's in a parasympathetic nervous system state where it's at rest. And we don't spend a lot of time in that state in the modern world because we're so busy, we're rushing, there's so much sensory input. So we probably have to work harder to do it. One technique that has gained a lot of attention is mindfulness training or mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is the idea that you consciously focus on your breathing and paying attention to the moment instead of rushing from one task to another and worrying about the past or worrying about the future. I suspect that in the olden, parents had different stressors than we do. They didn't have to do mindfulness training because they had to walk miles just to get to school or work. And if you're just walking along with no electronic input, you are in a parasympathetic state. Same thing when you're doing housework or gardening or other things. So part of the problem is that in the modern world, we haven't left time for that. Now, this is not a new idea, and certainly many of the Eastern religions have talked about yoga, meditation. You can talk about Tai Chi. And sometimes these feel a little artificial to folks, or they say, well, I'm going to feel strange when I do it. But I urge people to think about relaxation the same way you would about taking up a sport, which is that you have to research what fits for you. If you don't like water, then don't become a swimmer. Go run. Find yoga or Tai Chi and then get some help learning. Don't assume you can do it all by yourself. So go to a class or watch a video, read a book, and then practice. Because the point is you want to practice until it becomes easy to do. Otherwise, if it's not easy for you to do, then you're certainly not going to be able to apply it when you're in a stressful situation and need to calm down. Now, another thing you can do is a guided relaxation. And this sort of technique allows you to focus on your breathing as well as on the way you relax your muscles and how you let your mind focus. Now, I want to be mindful of time, Susan, so do you want me to give an example, or would you rather go on with the slides and see if we have time at the end?
I was thinking you could do the example, and I would run through some of the anxiety and depression slides that I can get through pretty quickly, and you can chime in when you would like to.
Okay,
that would I think that this would be worthwhile.
All right. Well, wherever you are sitting, just relax. It doesn't have to be a perfect place or a perfect chair, because oftentimes you won't be in a perfect place when you're relaxing. First thing I'd like you to do is just gradually close your eyes. Take a couple of breaths, not changing your breathing, but noticing. When you inhale, is it the same strength as when you exhale, or is there a change? How does your breath feel as it enters and leaves your chest? As you continue breathing slowly, I'd like you to shift your attention to the top of your forehead. As you do that, think about a light or an energy or a liquid, anything you want to imagine, flowing down your forehead, relaxing the muscles in your face and your cheeks. You might even feel your mouth opening a little bit, your tongue dropping, your shoulders relaxing, chest in your body expanding. Sometimes you might feel your body as heavy or warm as the relaxation moves down your legs all the way to your feet. You might think of stress flowing out of your hands and feet. As you breathe in, feeling a sense of relaxation. As you breathe out, allowing your body to settle in to a peaceful place where you feel how your muscles and your breath and your body feel as you're focusing on those sensations in the moment, enjoying those feelings, noticing whether your breath has changed, noticing whether your muscle tension has changed, and remembering that this is something you can access anytime you want, simply by slowing down and breathing. I'm going to count 1 to 3. As we do that, we'll slowly come back. 1, feeling your breath as it flows in and out. At 2, noticing yourself in the seat, feeling your body. And at 3, opening your eyes and feeling more alert, more awake, and noticing what's going on with you. There are a lot of tapes, a lot of ways that you can learn this if it feels good. Some people have trouble relaxing. They find they worry while they're relaxing. And if that's the case, you might want to get one of the tapes that gives instructions, like tensing your hands, so that you have something to think about. All right, I will add on that changing your stress, coping with stress, has to be a commitment, like you would to exercise or a diet or something else, because it's easy to get so busy that you forget how to do that. Now, sometimes stress can lead to anxiety or depression, and we're not talking about a little bit of worry or a bad day. We're talking about biological, clinical symptoms for which there are actually very good treatments if you identify and get that help. So I can let Susan go through this if you want to.
Okay, I mean, you were certainly moving your way into it already.
But, I'll go ahead and give me
okay.
a heads up if I need to.
Okay.
One of the big problems people have is that they think that somehow depression or anxiety shows a lack of willpower or vulnerability or somehow is a failing. And what we know more and more is that these are psychological conditions that are affected by your genetics, your biology, and the way that your brain is wired. Anxiety is sort of an extended version of fear. So fear is being worried about an actual threat. Anxiety is worrying, ruminating, thinking that bad things are going to happen even when there isn't a threat. Sometimes you might have panic attacks, which almost can feel like a heart attack. People get so distraught and have such fight or flight responses. Sometimes people who are anxious will start to avoid situations, other people, or engage in repetitive behaviors as a way to stave off the anxiety. And what we really want people to know from a psychological point of view is that anxiety is one of the most common disorders in this country, that many people experience anxiety over their lifetimes, and that probably a lot of aspects of modern life, including things like the media, technology, deadlines, not exercising enough, are contributing to that. If you feel like you're experiencing some of these signs of anxiety, worry, trouble sleeping, physiological problems, then it's worth it to try to get some help. A lot of times you can start with your medical doctor, or you might want to refer yourself to a psychologist, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the other thing that people sometimes experience as a result of stress is depression. And again, clinical depression is not feeling bad because you were disappointed in a friend or had a bad day. It is a persistent change in your behavior, interferes with your life. And one of the questions we have in the psychology world is, why are rates of depression going up in the modern world? And why are younger people, kids and teens, reporting higher levels of depression as well? In my book, I talk about that a lot, and I really do think that there's an argument to be made that depression is a response to some of the changes in our lifestyle, our behavior, our exercise, our exposure to regular light, and our expectations. If you look at the signs of depression, you'll see that there are clear definitions so that it is not the case that someone who's having a bad day is depressed, but if it lasts, if it's interfering with function, if there are changes in things like sleeping, eating, how you feel, how you concentrate, or negative, hopeless kinds of feelings, or thoughts of suicide, or turning to things like alcohol, then you really do want to get help from a professional, because there are ways. There are screening tools for depression, and some are listed on the slide about where to go for help. Your medical doctor, your regular doctor, can refer you. Mental health practitioners, if you have insurance, look on your health insurance list. If you don't, look at community lists in your area, or go to sites like the National Association for the Mentally Ill, and they will have lists. Some companies have employee assistants which can provide help. So the key is to find somebody who can help you figure out if there is a medication or a treatment like cognitive behavioral therapy or other interventions, behaviors that you can do to feel better. Now, sometimes when people are depressed, they feel like everything's hopeless, and sometimes when they're anxious, they feel like they can't do it. But always, when I talk to people who got help for depression and anxiety, they're glad that they did. And I'm going to hand over now because we want to talk a little bit about Families for Depression Awareness.
Thank you so much, Dr. McNaughton-Castle. I am taking to heart your suggestion, don't read them, delete them. That's going to become one of my my new mantras. So if someone writes to me and you don't hear back, that may be it. Pick up the phone and call me. So Families for Depression Awareness, we were founded in 2001, and our mission is to help families recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder to get people well and prevent suicides. It's the basis of our approach is that depression and bipolar disorder affect the whole family. It could be that more than one person in the family has depression or bipolar disorder. It could be that one of these kids in this picture would have a genetic predisposition toward having a mood disorder. It could be that one of the adults is feeling so overwhelmed by the other one's depression that they too need some help and support. So we look at the whole family, and we believe that the family has a critical role in helping people to get well. Please visit our website. You probably already have because you've registered for this program. We redid it about a year ago, and we're very pleased with it. We welcome your feedback. We have free webinars. I had mentioned earlier a couple of these. And so if you're interested in bipolar disorder, please go and hear that. I'm also thrilled that we have 2 new webinars that we're adding to our repertoire. You can find on our website already the recorded version of our More Than Mood Depression Symptoms webinar. It talks a lot about the cognitive symptoms of depression, and I'll speak about that in a moment. And coming up on June 27th, I urge you to register and tune in for our program that we're doing in collaboration with the National Council for Behavioral Health, because we want everyone to know what's at stake for our mental health care as changes go through Congress and through the administration. On our website, you'll find stories and interviews from people just like you who have gotten through it. You'll also find information from experts like how to communicate as a family, talking to your teen, other approaches. We have some online tools. We have a mental health family tree, which is great for helping clinicians to figure out if there's bipolar disorder. We have a wellness analyzer where you define your own wellness goals. And we, as you know, have the depression and bipolar screening test. We also have just added this information on, as I said, the cognitive symptoms of depression. We have a whole toolkit there. We came up with this acronym ROAM because we think of these symptoms of depression as affecting your reasoning, organization, attention, and memory. And these are things that a lot of people are not aware of. These symptoms can persist beyond when other symptoms are well under control. And so it's something that you should be informed about so that you can advocate for your loved one, figure out what's going on for yourself, and speak with your providers in a knowledgeable way where you're asking them the questions that you need the answers to. In Massachusetts, we offer a program where we train young adults and teens to share their stories, and we bring them to audiences here and there. Not everyone can participate in this because they're not in Massachusetts, but we are accepting videotapes from people where they talk about their symptoms of depression, how they manage to stay well. So please be in touch with us if you're interested in that. Also, again, this is local, but it's a national award. We received funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute in order to look into issues of parental involvement, how to improve parental involvement in the care of their teens who are of low income and are experiencing depression or bipolar disorder. So we're thrilled about it. We hope you take a minute to take a look at what we're doing. We'll be hopefully moving into Tier 2 in the fall. We have a variety of publications, including workshops that allow you to present this program in your community, in your circles. We also have wellness guides, the ones for parents and teens, Let Them Work Together, available in English and Spanish. The other thing that we do is Care for Your Mind, which is a blog that we do in collaboration with the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. We cover a lot of topics. We take personal views, we take expert views, and we try to examine what's wrong with our mental health system and how can we fix it. I would very much like to thank Dr. McNaughton-Castle for presenting this program. Julie McGrath has provided us with content support. We get educational support from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and we receive funding from the Allergan Foundation, for which we are very grateful. I also want to thank you for taking the time to join us. We will have a couple of minutes for questions and answers, and just wanted to remind you that people like you make the difference in us being able to offer these programs. I want to remind you too, please to fill out the evaluations. We will gladly send you the Coping with Stress brochure. And I'm going to segue right into this question that we got. Dr. McNaughton-Castle, do you have any advice? Do you have any advice for someone who's overly stressed by feeling that they have this essential role to be a social justice warrior, that they need to fight racism and get into constant arguments on Facebook?
Yes. My solution is that it doesn't help to win the battle. Fighting with people in your social circle who may or may not be listening to you on Facebook. So I say broaden your effect. Get into a group that maybe is trying to change policy on an issue, or work with teams trying to make them more aware of issues. Do something larger, because when it's a one-on-one fight on social media, it just becomes an argument and it doesn't change anything about policy. So look for an action that you can take in the larger world.
And this is just advice that we could give to other people, because my guess is that the person who wrote in is not the one feeling the social justice warrior impulse. So trying to help our friends that we're seeing engage. I mean, I have to say one thing that I do is that I disengage from people who are providing messaging that is making me feel angry and stressed. And you know, sometimes the political is personal, because it affects our rights. I mean, this is part of why we're doing this webinar on June 27th, is because these things that people are treating as, you know, just another decision are going to be deciding whether, you know, at what level we're going to be able to access mental health care. So,
absolutely. But you know what I would also say is every time a student tells me that the world has never been this divided, I say, wait a minute. Do you remember the Revolution, the Civil War? We had people in families fighting on different sides. This country's history has gone through ups and downs and stress. And sometimes you really do have to separate your personal frustration and stress with policies, and remember that in the long, long run, things tend to sort out. And so, yes, you're right. You have to act locally. You have to take those breaks. But my local PBS station has been running a campaign to get people to listen. And I will say that on a couple of occasions, I live here in Texas, I have run into people who I like, who I disagree with greatly on politics, and when I stop trying to convince them I'm right and ask them, will you tell me your solution? What would you like to see have happen? It has always turned into a really interesting conversation. So I think part of it is for us to stop assuming that we have to convince each other, but try more to understand each other.
Someone asked for ways that a religious community can offer help to people who are struggling with mental health issues.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, having spiritual beliefs and being part of a religious community is actually protective. It does look like those are strength or resilience factors for people with mental health. But I think that the place that organizations, religious or not, can help is reducing the stigma in seeking help, encouraging or helping people to find professional help if they need it, and also what you mentioned, which is advocating for mental health care. I see on your website that you have active minds, and if any of your listeners are affiliated with universities, check out their website. It's a student-run group with chapters across the country working on reducing student stigma about mental health so that people will get the support they need.
Quickly, do you have any suggestions about what to do when the clinician that you are going to see has a very long wait? What are ways that you can manage in the interim?
Yeah. There are things that you can read. I like Rapid Relief from Emotional Stress. Any of the websites that are listed on this page, like NAMI, can be helpful. Sometimes there are sources. If you don't have insurance or you're waiting a super long time with your clinician, I always tell people are aware that like dental schools will have opportunities where students can get dental work for a lower cost. Colleges that have clinical training programs or counseling training programs sometimes have services. You're seeing a student in training, but the cost can be more reasonable. Also, there are community emergency sites. If you get into that position, you might have to use those. But this is going back to Susan's concern about the policy and the funding, because the harder it is to get mental health care, the more difficult we make it for people to get better.
Okay, I just have two things to mention. One, going back to the religious community, I would like to say that one other thing that they can do is to gather up a list of community resources so that they can share that with people and be a source of referrals. I think that that can be very helpful. The other is someone asked us if we could go back a couple of slides, and we can't, but you, the listener, can download the slides. And if you have any trouble with that, then just please send us an email. We'll be happy to help you. We are at the point where we are pretty much out of time. I thank you again, Dr. McNaughton-Castle. It's been a pleasure and incredibly informative. Please, everybody,
I'm so glad.
Thank you. Go and do the online survey. We count on your feedback so that we can keep making our programs better. Take seriously your own commitment to yourself. Figure out what it is that you're going to do to yourself to help manage your stress, when you're going to do it, and then stick to it. And if it's hard, just remind yourself that you're worth it. If you are inclined, then go on over to our website and take the Depression and Bipolar Screening Test. You'll find it under the Help Someone tab, even if that someone is yourself. And, by all means, please visit our website and learn more about us, because we'd love to get to know you as well. I wish you all a very unstressful rest of the evening and much success in implementing ways to manage your stress. Good night.